The cold seeps into my bones, deeper than the air conditioning could ever reach. It's the silence in the room, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, a wedding present from his mother, ironically. My hands are clenched in my lap, knuckles white against the dark fabric of my dress. Across the polished mahogany desk, his face is a mask I don't recognize. It's hard, set, devoid of the warmth I knew for 15 years.
He doesn't look at me.
His lawyer, a woman in a severe gray suit, speaks, her voice like chipped ice. She's explaining things, legal terms, settlements, timelines. But the words blur. All I hear is the echo of his voice, days ago, casual, almost dismissive. I'm filing for divorce, just like that. After the shock, the numbness, came the cold. It starts in my gut and spreads, a deep, aching frost. I look at his profile, the slight tilt of his chin, the way he avoids my gaze. He has everything now, and he's leaving me with nothing. Not just emotionally, but literally. I found out yesterday. My accounts. Empty. All of them.
Blocked.
The shared ones, of course. But also the small personal one. The one I barely used, holding the remnants of my own savings from before we married.
Gone.
A clean sweep. The lawyer is still talking. Something about equitable distribution, it sounds like a joke. Equitable? When one person inherits nearly $500 million and the other is locked out of every cent. I feel a laugh bubbling up, hysterical, sharp, but I swallow it down. It would shatter this fragile, awful peace. He shifts slightly, impatience radiating off him like heat from a furnace, though the room is freezing. He just wants this over. He got what he wanted. The money. All of it. And now he wants me gone. Invisible. Like I never existed. The tick-tock of the clock is deafening. It marks the seconds of my life draining away, measured in expensive wood and legal jargon. I just sit there, frozen, watching the man I loved erase me. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. Before the cold, before the silence, there was noise. Laughter in our kitchen, the clinking of glasses with friends, the hum of our life, comfortable and predictable. We built it piece by piece over 15 years. Not on inherited wealth, but on shared dreams, late nights working, sacrificing. I'd put my own career on hold, not completely, but shifted its focus, made it flexible so I could be there. There for him, for us, for the life we were building. We weren't struggling, not really. He had his business, a solid, growing company he'd started from scratch, years before we even met. I had my freelance work, enough to contribute, enough to feel independent, enough to save a little. We lived well, comfortable. Not the kind of wealth that turns heads, but the kind that felt safe, earned. We talked about the future, about slowing down eventually, about travel. These weren't grand, impossible fantasies. They felt real, achievable, built on the foundation of his work, my work, our partnership. That was the beginning. Ordinary, in the best possible way. Then came the letter. Not a letter, really. An email first. From a lawyer in Switzerland. An uncle of his, a relative neither of us had ever met, not even mentioned. Elderly, solitary, passed away. And, apparently, immensely wealthy. The email seemed like spam, a scam. We almost deleted it. But something, a name, a vague family connection he remembered his grandmother mentioning once, made him pause. He forwarded it to his company's legal team. They verified it. It was real. Staggeringly, incomprehensibly real. An inheritance. Not just a few million. 9 figures. 45, followed by 7 zeros. $450 million. The number itself felt fictional. Like something out of a movie. The first few weeks were a blur of disbelief, excitement, cautious planning. We talked for hours. What would this mean? How would it change things? We promised each other it wouldn't change us. It would just make things easier. More freedom. Less worry. We talked about securing our future, maybe starting a foundation, investing wisely. His business, already successful, suddenly had access to capital it could only dream of before. It wasn't just his money, it was ours. That's what he said.
Ours.
He flew to Switzerland, met with lawyers, handled the formalities. When he came back, he seemed different. Taller.
More. Contained.
Less laughter. More quiet intensity. I chalked it up to the shock, the weight of it all. It was a huge adjustment. We started looking at different houses, talking to financial advisors. The future stretched out, vast and glittering. I felt secure, happier than I'd been in years, maybe ever. This wasn't just financial security. It felt like the ultimate validation of our life together, our partnership. We had faced challenges, like any couple, but we'd built something strong. This felt like the universe rewarding that. The first crack appeared subtly. Little things. A new watch I didn't recognize, impossibly expensive. Dinners out without telling me, with people he vaguely described as business contacts, less time at home. More late nights at the office. Even after the initial inheritance, dust had settled. When I asked, he was dismissive. Just managing things, you know. It's complicated now. He started making decisions about our shared finances without consulting me. A new car appeared in the driveway, ordered without discussion. When I raised an eyebrow, he just shrugged. It's just money, honey. We have plenty now. The phrase felt wrong. The way he said it, the entitlement in his voice. It wasn't just money. It was our money, earned and now inherited. It was the freedom it represented, the partnership it was supposed to solidify. Instead, it felt like a wall going up. Then came the conversation that wasn't a conversation. It was an announcement. Over dinner. A dinner we rarely had together anymore. He didn't look at me when he said it. Stared at his plate, fork pushing food around. I've been thinking, he said, his voice flat. About us. About everything. My heart sank. I knew that tone. That distance.
This.
Change, he continued, referring to the inheritance with a casual wave of his hand. It's made me realize things. About what I want. What I need. He finally looked up, his eyes cold, hard. I want a divorce. The world tilted. The air left my lungs. I couldn't speak. Couldn't move. All the promises, the shared dreams, the 15 years, they crumbled into dust around me. Why? I finally whispered, the word raw in my throat. He sighed, a sound of pure impatience. It's just
time.
We've grown apart. This inheritance. It changes things. It gives me options. Apparently, one of those options was discarding me. He talked about it like a business decision, a logical next step.
No emotion. No regret.
Just cold, brutal efficiency. He expected me to understand, to agree, to make it easy. He told me his lawyer would be in touch. The conversation was over.
Just like that.
The inciting incident. Not a bang, but a cold, calculated whisper that extinguished everything. The days after were a nightmare. I tried to reach him. He didn't answer my calls.
Didn't respond to my texts.
The man I shared my life with for 15 years vanished behind a wall of silence and legal representation. Then came the practical blow. I went to the grocery store. My card declined. Confused, I tried another shared card.
Declined. Panic started to set in.
I drove to the bank. Sat down with a manager. They looked uncomfortable. They couldn't give me details, but confirmed the accounts were inaccessible to me. All of them, including my personal one. A joint decision, they said, citing directives from the primary account holder, him. He hadn't just filed for divorce. He had cut me off. Financially, completely. This wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. This was about control. About power. About leaving me stranded, vulnerable, with no access to funds, not even my own small savings. How was I supposed to live? Pay for anything? Hire a lawyer? The sheer ruthlessness of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just legal maneuvering, it felt personal, cruel. Like he wanted me to suffer, to be helpless. He had taken everything he could immediately lay his hands on, leaving me with the shell of our life and mounting bills. Finding a lawyer felt impossible without money. I borrowed a small amount from a friend, Enough for an initial consultation. The first few lawyers I spoke to seemed intimidated by the scale of the inheritance, by his legal team. They spoke of protracted battles, uncertainty, the difficulty of tracing assets. They looked at me with pity, or worse, suspicion, as if I was just another woman trying to grab a piece of sudden wealth, disregarding the 15 years, the partnership, the life I'd put on hold for us. They didn't see me. They saw a potential contingency fee and a difficult, expensive fight against a man with limitless resources. The cold fear in my gut intensified. I felt isolated, outmatched, staring down an impossible adversary. His legal team was relentless. They filed motions, set deadlines that felt impossible to meet. They sent me papers detailing his position, that the inheritance was separate property, acquired after the marriage, and I had no claim to it. They painted me as a dependent, someone who had coasted while he built his success, someone who was now trying to exploit his sudden good fortune. The narrative they were building was a twisted, ugly distortion of our reality. Every piece of legal correspondence felt like a punch, designed to wear me down, to make me give up. My freelance work, which had been a steady trickle, became my lifeline. But it wasn't enough. Not for living expenses in the city we'd called home, and certainly not for a drawn-out legal battle against a team of expensive sharks. I cut back drastically, moved into a smaller, cheaper apartment, sold what I could, furniture, jewelry that wasn't sentimental. Every step felt like a concession, a shrinking of my world. I felt the weight of his power pressing down on me, using the very wealth that should have secured our future to dismantle mine. The legal pressure mounted. His team pushed for mediation, but on their terms. They offered a pittance, a fraction of what 15 years of marriage and contribution should have entailed, let alone the context of the inheritance. It was an insult, designed to humiliate me, to force me to accept defeat. My borrowed money was running out. The initial lawyer, though kind, seemed hesitant to engage in the kind of scorched-earth warfare his side was waging. Doubts crept in. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was powerless against that kind of money, that kind of legal muscle. Maybe I should just take their offer and disappear. The thought was a heavy, dark cloak, threatening to smother any remaining hope. One particularly brutal court filing landed on my doorstep. It was a motion for summary judgment, basically asking the judge to rule in his favor without a trial, arguing there were no material facts in dispute, that the inheritance was his alone, and my contributions to the marriage were negligible in this new financial landscape. Reading it felt like being erased from existence. They argued that any support I provided was simply the expected role of a spouse, not a material contribution warranting a share of his separate property. It was dehumanizing. I stared at the pages, tears blurring the legal jargon. All my fears, all my struggles, seemed to culminate in this document. It felt like the end, like he had won, like I was truly alone, facing down an empire with nothing but my depleted bank account and a crumbling sense of self-worth. This was the deepest point of the crisis. Everything was falling apart. All hope seemed lost. I sat in the small, sterile office of a new lawyer, referred to me by a distant acquaintance who had heard snippets of my story. She was different. Older, sharp-eyed, no nonsense. She listened patiently as I recounted the last few months, the inheritance, the cut-off accounts, the relentless legal attacks. When I finished, there wasn't pity in her eyes, but a cold, calculating focus that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She didn't dwell on the injustice or the emotional betrayal. She talked strategy. She asked about his business, not just its current state, but its history, how it was funded, structured, how it grew over the years we were married. She asked about his initial capital, any loans he took out, any investments made during the marriage before the inheritance. She was looking for something else, something beyond the obvious. Then she hit on something. You mentioned he used his business legal team to verify the inheritance initially? She asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Yes, I said. He forwarded the email to them, she nodded, making a note. And his business. It was doing well before the inheritance. Very well, I confirmed. He'd built it up significantly. It was his pride and joy. And where is that business now? She asked. Still operating, obviously, I said. He's using the inheritance money to expand it, I think. Investing heavily. She leaned back, a slow, thoughtful look on her face. Inheritance can be separate property, she mused. But assets acquired during the marriage, using marital effort or funds, are usually marital property. And business growth during a marriage. That's a complex area. She tapped her pen on her desk. And if marital funds or assets were commingled with the inheritance, or if the inheritance money was used to benefit a marital asset like a business built during the marriage, things get very interesting. A spark ignited within me. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It wasn't even just about survival. It was about justice. About fighting back against the calculated cruelty, the attempt to erase my contribution, my existence. He thought the inheritance made him untouchable, that he could use its immense power to simply bulldoze me. But maybe there was another angle. An angle he hadn't considered, or thought I wouldn't find. What are you thinking? I asked, my voice low, tinged with a nascent hope I hadn't felt in months. I'm thinking, she said, a glint in her eye, that his business wasn't just built on air. It has tangible assets, ongoing operations contracts. And it grew significantly over 15 years of marriage. I'm thinking that while he was focused on protecting his shiny new millions, he might have overlooked the foundation. The thing he built before the inheritance, the thing we can argue was a marital asset or certainly impacted by marital effort and support. And I'm thinking about leverage. My lawyer, Eleanor, moved with quiet intensity. While his team continued their assault, focusing on proving the inheritance was separate property, Eleanor was digging elsewhere. She subpoenaed business records. She brought in forensic accountants. She wasn't just looking at the inheritance money, she was dissecting the financial history of his company, the one he started years before me, but which had flourished and scaled significantly during our marriage. She explained her strategy. The inheritance itself might be classified as separate, but his business had grown exponentially during our marriage. Marital effort, even if primarily his, supported by the partnership, contributes to the value of a business in many jurisdictions. Furthermore, if he was now using the inheritance money to invest in that marital growth business, things became incredibly complicated for him. He was potentially commingling separate and marital assets, tying his untouchable inheritance to something that was very much fair game in a divorce settlement. The turning point wasn't a single dramatic event, but a quiet, internal shift. Sitting with Eleanor, looking at spreadsheets and legal codes, I realized this wasn't just about getting a fair settlement. It was about forcing him to acknowledge the 15 years we had built together, to prevent him from simply erasing me and that shared history. The fear was still there, a knot in my stomach, but beneath it, a hard, cold resolve began to solidify. He wanted a war? I would give him one. But not on his terms, fighting over the scraps he'd left me. On Eleanor's terms. On my terms. I wouldn't just survive. I would fight to ensure his attempt to destroy me financially became his biggest liability. The strategy wasn't about grabbing the inheritance. It was about targeting the foundation he stood on, the business he thought was safe, separate from the divorce battle over his new fortune. This was my final decision. No more playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive. Eleanor worked methodically, silently building our case. We weren't responding to every single one of his team's aggressive filings. We were focused on discovery related to his business, its valuation, its growth during the marriage, and, crucially, the flow of funds from the inheritance into it. It felt slow, agonizingly so. Meanwhile, my financial situation remained precarious. The strain was immense. Doubt would creep in during the dark hours of the night. Was this worth it? Could we actually win against that kind of power? His legal team, sensing our focus had shifted away from directly attacking the inheritance, seemed to become complacent, almost arrogant. They saw it as a sign of weakness, that we had conceded the main point, and were now scrabbling for minor assets. They continued to push for a quick, unfavorable settlement, confident that they held all the cards. They had the 9-figure inheritance, They had him locked out of his accounts, and they believed his business was largely immune to claims related to an inheritance received only months ago. They underestimated Eleanor. They underestimated the depth of her research. And they profoundly underestimated my resolve. She found it. The paper trail. Significant transfers from the inheritance funds, not just for personal luxury, but directly into his corporate accounts, labeled as investment capital, money used to acquire a competitor he'd been eyeing for years, to upgrade infrastructure, to hire key personnel at inflated salaries. Funds that were inextricably mixed with the existing, marital period growth of his business. He wasn't just protecting his separate property, he was using it to inflate the value of a potentially marital asset, muddying the waters completely. Eleanor called me. Her voice was calm, but there was a steely edge to it. "We have him," she said simply. "He commingled the funds, used the inheritance to invest directly into the operating business that grew during the marriage. That makes the business, and potentially the inheritance funds invested in it, subject to equitable distribution." The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, clear focus. This was it. The moment we had been building towards. The moment where the tables would turn. The hearing was scheduled for a procedural matter, something his lawyers probably considered routine. They arrived with their usual air of dismissive confidence. He was there too, looking bored, impatient, surrounded by his legal eagles. I sat beside Eleanor, my heart pounding, but my exterior calm. Eleanor stood up. She didn't launch into a long argument. She simply presented the evidence. The wire transfers. The corporate ledger entries. The documentation showing his direct investment of the inheritance funds into his business, not as a loan, but as equity, as investment capital. She argued, clearly and concisely, that this action had transformed potentially separate property into marital property by commingling and investing it directly into an asset whose value had increased significantly during the marriage. Then she delivered the blow. She requested an immediate, temporary injunction. A freeze. Not just on his personal accounts, which were already largely emptied or hidden, but on his corporate assets. The bank accounts of his business. The assets acquired with the newly injected inheritance funds. A freeze pending the full financial discovery and the court's determination of the marital versus separate nature of these commingled assets. The courtroom fell silent. His lawyers exchanged wide-eyed glances. They hadn't seen this coming. Their arguments had been solely focused on the inheritance itself, its origin outside the marriage. They hadn't anticipated an attack on the business, the very foundation of his financial power, and one he assumed was safe, separate from the messy divorce over newfound millions. The judge, after reviewing Eleanor's evidence and listening to her precise, compelling argument, looked at his stunned legal team. They stammered, trying to object, arguing the business was separate, that the inheritance was separate, that a corporate freeze was excessive and would damage the company. Eleanor countered, her voice unwavering. "His actions have intertwined these assets, Your Honor. The potential marital interest in the business, significantly increased by the injection of these funds, requires protection. A temporary freeze is necessary to prevent further dissipation or hiding of assets that may be subject to division." The judge nodded slowly. "Ms. Vance," he addressed Eleanor, using her name, giving weight to her words. "Your arguments are persuasive. The evidence of commingling is clear. A temporary injunction freezing the specified corporate accounts and assets is granted pending further order of this court." A collective gasp filled the room. I didn't look at him initially. I kept my gaze on the judge, on Eleanor. But I could feel it. The shift in the room. The sudden, sharp intake of breath from his side of the table. His lawyers were white-faced, frantically whispering to each other. Then I looked at him. His mask of indifference shattered. His eyes were wide with disbelief, then morphed into pure, unadulterated rage. His face contorted. He half rose from his chair, his mouth opening. And he screamed. He didn't scream words, not at first. Just a guttural, primal sound of shock and fury. Then, words erupted, directed not at the judge, but at his own lawyers, a torrent of accusations. What have you done? How could you let this happen? My company. You idiots. You absolute fools. He was completely blindsided. He'd been so focused on protecting the inheritance, on using its sheer weight to crush me, that he'd exposed his flank. He thought his business, the source of his established power, was safe ground. He thought the inheritance was the only battlefield. He hadn't realized that by mixing the two, by using the untouchable money to fuel his existing safe asset, he tied them together with a not only a forensic accountant and a brilliant lawyer could unravel. And now, his ability to operate his business, his source of power and identity, was frozen. The climax wasn't a shouting match between us. It was his scream of realization, of utter defeat, directed at the very people he'd paid handsomely to protect him. It was the sound of his empire, built on control and calculation, suddenly teetering because of his own hubris. He had underestimated me. He had underestimated Eleanor. And he had underestimated the paper trail. The immediate aftermath was chaos on his side. His lawyers were scrambling, trying to calm him, trying to understand the implications of the freeze. For me, it was a moment of stunned, quiet victory. It wasn't joy, not exactly. More like a profound sense of vindication, cold and sharp. He had tried to render me powerless, to erase me, and in doing so, he had exposed his own vulnerability. His attempt to weaponize his wealth had backfired spectacularly. The freeze on his corporate assets changed everything. Suddenly, he wasn't holding all the cards. His business operations were impacted. Deals were put on hold. His powerful, untouchable facade crumbled. He was forced to negotiate seriously. The days of insulting offers were over. The legal battle continued for months, but the power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. We weren't fighting over whether the inheritance was separate. We were fighting over the value of a business whose growth during the marriage was now undeniably linked to those inheritance funds. The commingling, his panicked reaction, the freeze, it all worked to level the playing field. The final settlement wasn't $500 million. That was never the goal, not really. The inheritance was vast, and its separate nature was still a significant factor. But it was a substantial settlement. Enough to rebuild my life, to invest, to secure my future in a way that his initial cruel offer would never have allowed. It acknowledged the 15 years, the partnership, the life we built before the money poisoned everything. It acknowledged my right to not be discarded and impoverished because he'd hit the financial jackpot. Walking out of the lawyer's office after the final papers were signed, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. Relief, yes, deep and bone-weary. Vindication, a cold, hard satisfaction that I hadn't let him win, that I had fought back intelligently and effectively. But also, a profound sadness. The money hadn't just ended a marriage, it had revealed a capacity for cruelty I hadn't known existed in the man I'd loved. The inheritance hadn't brought freedom, it had brought isolation, mistrust, and ultimately, a bitter battle. I had survived. More than survived. I had thrived in the face of his attempt to dismantle me. I had learned resilience, strategy, and the importance of having someone brilliant like Eleanor in your corner. The money he tried to use as a weapon against me became, indirectly, the source of my own regained security and independence, not because I took his inheritance, but because his handling of it, his arrogance, allowed me to leverage what was rightfully part of our shared history. The world isn't simple. People aren't simple. And sometimes, the greatest battles are fought not with fists or words, but with subpoenas and balance sheets. He got his inheritance. I got my freedom, hard-won and expensive, bought with sleepless nights and relentless pressure, but ultimately on my own terms. The silence now is different. Not empty, not cold. Just quiet. The sound of a new beginning, built not on luck, but on strength I didn't know I had. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps bring more of these stories to life.